And now, without further ado, I will answer your questions. And as always, I will strive to be as thorough as possible, as clear as possible, and as concise as possible. The first question is about eye health, in particular, eye health protocols for people that are aging, but eye health protocols for people in general. The question is, I'm noticing that my vision, both close and far, is deteriorating. What are the best eye exercises, eye health behaviors, supplements, etc. for the aging eye? So the answer I'm about to provide applies to everybody, regardless of age, which is you want to make sure that you view things both close up and far away across your day. Many people nowadays spend a lot of time looking at their smartphone, looking at the computer screen, looking at books and paper. In other words, looking at things somewhere between 9 inches away from their face and their eyes, maybe 2.5 feet away from their face and eyes. This is an unprecedented event in human history, as far as we know, because it wasn't until the advent of the smartphone that we've spent so much time looking at screens at close range relative to looking at things at further distances from our face throughout the day. In fact, it should come as no surprise that the incidence of myopia, of nearsightedness, is increasing dramatically around the world, but is increasing particularly fast in children and in young adults and even in adults who are viewing things at very close range, so 2.5 feet or less. Now, I am not saying that viewing things at 2.5 feet or less is bad for your eyes. That is simply not the case. However, if you want your vision to be maintained or even improve, it's going to be very important for you to view things at a distance as well, for ideally several hours per day. Now, I realize some people just simply won't accomplish this. In fact, I'd like everyone to just take a moment and do a rough estimation in your head of how much time during your daytime activities you are viewing things at, say, 2.5 feet or 3 feet or less. So smartphone, computer screen, paper, books, etc., versus viewing things that are 4 feet away, 8 feet away. So maybe conversation across a table with another human being. Remember those? Some of us are doing that more now that we seem to be emerging from this whole pandemic phase. However, many people are still mostly just viewing things within very close range. And in fact, if you were to ask yourself, how much time do you spend looking at things at the distance of many hundreds of feet, or taking a walk where you're not looking at any screen and you're simply letting visual images, or the visual imagery rather, pass by on your eyes? I think for most of us, that number is getting progressively smaller and smaller with each passing year. So this is an issue because the structure of the eye is such that the lens of the eye can move, but also that the length of the eyeball from front to back is actually impacted by how close or how far you happen to view things during the course of your day, especially during development. There's a classic experiment that I'd like to just briefly describe to you, which has been performed in chickens. It's been performed in mice. It's also been performed on humans, where a visual occluder or a visual image, so an occluder is just a black sort of screen or piece of cardboard, or a image, maybe some black and white checks or checkers, are placed at a certain distance from the eye, either up close or far away. And the impact of that on the length of the eyeball and on the structure of the lens and on the quality and acuity of vision is then measured. And to make a long story short, what these studies show is that if during development you or an animal exclusively looks at things that are up close, very close to the eye, and doesn't ever get long-range vision, the eyeball lengthens. And when that happens, the lens, which of course is in the front of the eyeball, which focuses the light onto the back of the eyeball, which is where the so-called neural retina is, where the cells that sense light are, that visual image lands in front of, as opposed to directly on, the light sensing portion of the eyeball that we call the neural retina. It lands too close or near the lens as opposed to on the back of the eyeball. And that's part of the reason what we call the consequence of that nearsighted myopia. In farsightedness, the opposite happens. The visual image is actually focused behind the retina. It doesn't land directly on the retina, which is what you want. It's focused too far behind the retina, and that's due to a shortening of the eyeball. So what I just described actually explains pretty well why kids who look at computer screens or books up close often need glasses. When I was growing up, they called this nerd syndrome. Raising my hand for those of you that are listening. I read an awful lot, but I also spent time outside, fortunately, and running around on the soccer field and looking at things in the distance and playing in the neighborhood with my friends. Kids that spend the vast amount of their time looking at things up close, in particular children who do that indoors for most of their waking time, well, those kids develop myopia. This is part of the reason why we have such an increase of the incidence of myopia nowadays. What's interesting, and I think most people don't realize, is that even as a young adult, and perhaps even as an older adult, an elderly person, looking at things up close too much at the expense of getting some time viewing things at a distance, in particular outdoors, can be very problematic because it can exacerbate myopia. So the short, direct prescription here is to make sure that you're getting at least an hour or so each day, although ideally it would be more, of long viewing. And that could be done by walking outside and avoiding looking at your phone while walking. It doesn't require that you look at a particular object in the distance. Although if you are scanning for and looking for objects in the distance, the way that you might on a hike, or you're looking out toward or off a vista, or you're looking for someone in the distance, all of that sort of visual scanning behavior is going to be very good for your eye health and for maintaining vision at a distance. If you're somebody who's farsighted and you have trouble seeing things up close, well, then you need to ask yourself whether or not you're spending too much time looking at things off in the distance. Although I want to be very clear that nearsightedness and farsightedness aren't necessarily the consequence of this near-far viewing. There can be independent causes of nearsightedness and farsightedness. But for many people out there who are spending progressively more and more time just looking at things up close, you can get this lengthening of the eyeball or challenges in the way that the elasticity of the lens is controlled by the musculature in ways that make it hard to maintain sharp, crisp vision when you are looking at things at a distance or up close. Okay, so I can't, because there are simply no studies to support the idea that you need exactly 2 hours per day of outside long vision at a particular distance, or that you want to cut off or have a threshold of 4 hours per day of looking at things up close. But we can say with a high degree of confidence that if you want to maintain or enhance your vision at all distances, that for every hour or so that you spend looking at things, say a distance of 3 feet away or less, that you want to get at least 1 hour per day total, doesn't have to be all at once, of looking at things out in the distance or looking at things beyond 3 feet relative to the distance from your eye. Okay, so I think for some people who are already badly myopic, this isn't going to remedy that myopia. You're still going to need corrective lenses. But if you're somebody similar to the person who asked the question, that they're quote unquote noticing their vision is deteriorating, really try and balance out the amount of viewing that you're doing at close distance and long distance. And again, I would not obsess about the total numbers. It doesn't have to be 3 hours and 3 hours. But the more time that you can spend at viewing things at variable distance throughout the day, the better off you're going to be in maintaining and perhaps even enhancing your vision somewhat.